There's a neat little Greek word that we usually slaughter in our translations. The root word is hysteresis. The word of the text is hysteresis. The root word is this. It is the Greek word from which we get our word history. And Paul said, I went up to Jerusalem. I spent 15 days with Peter and James, the brother of Jesus. And the English usually gets translated like this. I saw them for 15 days. That's really a weak word. I saw them, or I got acquainted with them. But this word is what he did with them. I did this with them for 15 years. It's the root word from which we get our word history. Do we have anything like this in the ancient world? One liberal German historian, Hans von Kampenhausen, says, this text gives you everything that you could actually ask for from an ancient historical passage. Gives you the people, gives you the time, tells you the topic they were discussing, and you got the eyewitnesses here. Now, you folks know the story. According to the Gospels, Peter's a fisherman. Some of the other disciples are fishermen. What was James, the brother of Jesus? I don't know. Maybe he was a carpenter. But these are fairly simple, working class people. Paul's the one who sticks out like a sore thumb. He's like some of you who might be doing grad studies, right? Paul was trained under Gamaliel. You could say in our language he's got a PhD in Old Testament. He's a sharp guy, trained under the best, and then he's the one, he's a scholar athlete, he's the one they send out to round up all the Christians. He could be some little wimpy guy. He's got to walk across the countryside, pull these people out of homes, throw them into prison. I mean, you got a high-powered guy here. A scholar who wasn't afraid to round people up, and if things get a little bit rough, hey, that's okay. That's what I'm called here to do. And he's talking here with this, perhaps, carpenter, fisherman, and they're comparing notes on what Jesus looks like and what the gospel looks like. Okay. Now in Galatians 2, just a few verses later, there's no division in the original New Testament. The text just goes right on. Paul said, I went back up to Jerusalem later, 14 years later. I went back up to Jerusalem. Galatians 2:2 is one of the most interesting verses in the New Testament. Paul said, I set out the gospel that I was preaching. I put the gospel on the table. Remember, deity, death, resurrection of Jesus. I put it on the table, and I asked these guys, have I blown it? This is what I've been preaching for the last 14 years. Am I preaching the right thing? Thinking, Paul, you're asking that after 14 years? And I think he'd say, well, hey, look, I already asked him once. I spent 3 years with Jesus before that. And I met the risen Jesus just before that. I mean, what else do you want me to do? And I have a PhD in Old Testament, too. This guy is doing what scholars do. He studies the Old Testament. God intervenes, he meets Jesus. 3 years later, he goes to the guys who have also been with Jesus, a brother and a disciple. But when he comes back 14 years later, there's a fourth guy there. Does anybody know who it is? Paul? Pardon? No? Well, actually he brings Barnabas. That's a good point. But who's already in Jerusalem with him? Barnabas is his companion. John, the son of Zebedee. Now my point is, these are probably the four best known apostles in the ancient world. Right? Paul, John, Peter, and James, the brother of Jesus, the big four. And something else? Sometimes we think, I've let the Lord down, or I've died, but I haven't lived the best life. 3 of these 4 guys have blotches on their career. Paul was a persecutor. God had to shake him up. James was an unbeliever. The brother of Jesus was an unbeliever until he met the risen Jesus. The critical community is going to grant this. Peter, you know the story, denied the Lord 3 times. Only John, who traditionally is the disciple whom Jesus loved, only John didn't blow it. The other 3 guys have major marks against them. And Paul lays before them the gospel he teaches. And he says, verse 6, Galatians 2:6, they added nothing to me. It may not mean a lot to you, but what he says is, the others saw it the same way I do. They're reporting the same thing I am. And then when Paul writes 1 Corinthians 15, after he gives this list of occurrences, in verse 11, he does it the other way around. See, when he first went to see them, they recognized his work. When he went 14 years later, they said, we don't add anything to your gospel, we preach the same message. But in 1 Corinthians 15:11, Paul just got done talking about the appearances, and he got done talking about the other apostles, and he says, I don't even deserve to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church. And then he says this, 1 Corinthians 15:11, whether it is I or they, I don't care who you get it from. Get it from me, get it from the apostles, I don't care. I don't care who you get it from. So we preach, and so you believe. In other words, ask Peter, he'll tell you the same thing. Ask James, he'll tell you the same thing. Ask John, he'll tell you the same thing. Ask me, I've already told you. Now what that argument looks like is it locks like this. Because you got an eyewitness, Paul, who meets Jesus, or so he claimed, he goes to meet the other eyewitnesses 3 years later who met the risen Jesus. Peter, whose life needed to be straightened around after denying the Lord. James, the brother of Jesus, who didn't believe in him. You know, Mark chapter 3, says that his brothers thought he was nuts. They thought he had mental problems. The word is, it said he thought he was beside himself. The old phrase we used to use, he's in two minds. He's nuts. That's what that's what his brothers thought. And now James is in the fold. And here's John. And they're all telling the same story. By the way, you say, well, where do you get this, in Bible college? Okay, let me use the biggest named critics today. How old is this material? Paul gets this from the disciples about 35 AD. All right? Am I just saying this, or do critics agree with this? Okay. Gerd Ludemann, a German atheistic New Testament scholar. That's not conservative by definition. An atheistic New Testament scholar. He says this material dates no later, not the material, but the formalized, we have to talk about that, but this text is in a formal tradition, what we might call a catechism today. Gerd Ludemann says it is no later than 33 AD, plus 3. It's an atheistic New Testament scholar. No later than plus 3. The Jesus Seminar. How many of you know who the Jesus Seminar is? Okay, they're the guys that throw the beads in the hat and judge how many of the words of Jesus are authentic. Depending on how you count the colors, they've rejected between 80 and 90% of the red letter words of the New Testament. Not conservative. And the Jesus Seminar says that this material, here's Paul coming up to Jerusalem. When was he converted? Right here. The Jesus Seminar says this material predates Paul's conversion. Two of the last writers to write on it, two of the most influential theologians today, James D.G. Dunn and Larry Hurtado. These are the latest things, and they say this material goes back. I'm not talking about the mere teaching of it. I'm talking about the formalization of it. It goes back to 30 A.D. James D.G. Dunn, maybe the most influential New Testament scholar today, Dunn says it was there within months. Now, what are we looking for when you do history? Right place, right time. And I'm suggesting John is fine at plus 65, because that's still within plus-minus range. Luke, 55. Matthew, 50. Mark, 45. Paul, about 20 to start with. Preached it, about 25. Preached it about 21. Received at plus 5. But remember, if he received this from Peter and James and John, they had it before him. You know, I think Paul wore these fellows out. You know, he goes up to Jerusalem. Here comes the persecutor. According to Acts, nobody would even talk to him. They're afraid he was getting undercover material. He comes back later, 14